Hey folks, George here again with another work of Japanese literature. The work that we're going to talk about today is called the Kojiki. The Kojiki is the earliest work of Japanese literature that survives today. Yeah, it's more or less a collection of the creation myths and, of course, other sorts of genealogies that go from that creation myth. It's certainly the cornerstone text of the Shinto faith. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. How does all of that fit into the consolidation of political power? We're going to talk a lot about all that today. I hope that I won't get too much in detail because after all, this work was compiled finally in the year 712, and that means there's 1,300 years of history regarding this work. It's going to be impossible in one short, brief talk like this to discuss every detail. So we're going to leave a lot out, but we'll see what we can cover today, yeah? So, as always, what I like to do is discuss story elements on one hand, that's characters, setting, plot, and themes, and then also connections on the other hand, which is, story, rather textual structure, formal structures, historical connections, intertextual connections, and then, of course, connections to myself. Right? So with that in mind, let's start with the story elements. Characters. Who are the characters in the Kojiki and why are they interesting? The Kojiki has so many different stories within it, and thusly there's so many different characters in it. Yeah? I'm not going to go over every little detail and every character in this story. Rather, I just want to focus on probably the beginning, especially when we talk about the gods. So that is going to be where we're going to focus today, is on these key gods of the Kojiki, right? And so let's just start right at the beginning. The text starts us with, when heaven and earth first appeared, there came into existence in the plane of high heaven a deity named. So here we have a deity, right? We're going to talk about how some of these deities are named in a second, but let's take a look right now. There was a deity named Lord Midst of Heaven God, then High Creative Force God, then Divine Creative Force God. All of these three deities came into existence as single deities, and their form were not visible. Yet when the land was young, resembling floating oil and drifting like jellyfish, a thing sprouted forth like reed shoots. And from this there came into existence a deity named Splendid Reed Shoot God, and then Eternally Standing Heaven God. Now, I'm going to skip a couple of lines here and keep on reading these deities. Next came into existence Eternally Standing Land God, and then Abundant Clouds Field God. These two deities came into existence as single deities. Clay Male God and his spouse Silt Female God. Next, Emergent Form God, Living Form God, Great Male Organ God. Wow, that's interesting. And his spouse, Great Female Organ God. Next, Ample Face God. Then his spouse, Awe-Inspiring God. Next, Izanagi, He Who Invites God. And then his spouse, Izanami, She Who Invites God. So what I hope we could figure out right away is not that we're talking about a monotheistic religion, right? Similar to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which are examples of monotheism. Rather, we've got a text that's describing a polytheistic religion or a polytheistic collection of deities. There are deities, it seems, for every little thing. And as we read, there's deities for cleaning your crotch God, and cleaning the river God, and cleaning this God, and sneezing. People, certain gods sneeze, and that turns into gods. So we've just got this innumerable cast of deities. Now, why is that interesting to me? Well, I grew up in America, and I am not as exposed to such a polytheistic tradition, right? I was exposed to the monotheistic tradition within Christianity. So to see that there are other alternative theisms around the world, in this case Japan, kind of startles me, and I'm like, my goodness. So this is kind of like the Bible, and I want to try to connect it with the Judeo-Christian Bible, where there's a monotheistic religion, but it's going to be kind of hard to do that, right? Because after all, how does the Old Testament start? In the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God. One God. Here, we've got all sorts of gods, and as a reader, I'm already overwhelmed. I'll tell you what I do, usually. I underline key characters when I'm reading a story, when I'm reading any work of literature, and any text, really. I'm trying to underline key characters, but all I've got here is a list of characters. Which ones are the important ones? There's nothing in this long list that speaks out to me and says, this is going to be the important one that you should pay attention to as a reader. I can't keep track of them. I really can't. And so by the end of that very first chapter, I don't even know where I should focus my attention and whom I should think about, what questions to ask, because there are so many gods already. Well, okay, read a little bit further on, and what we will see is the last two gods mentioned, that I just mentioned, Izanagi, he who invites God, and his spouse Izanami are going to be key characters in the immediately following chapters, right? Well, my question is, having grown up in a monotheistic tradition, my question is, what about all those other gods? What happened to them? It might surprise you. I don't know. And the text, the Kojiki text, doesn't tell us. And that to me is fascinating, that there's just so many characters that are listed for us, and yet we already don't know where we're going. Right? What happened to all those other gods, those first gods, coming again from a Judeo-Christian background? At the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. There's one God. I know who the key character is. But here, the first gods are basically forgotten and never mentioned again. How can I make sense of that? Well, I can't make sense of that. That's how this work of religious text is going to function, right? And to ask that question sometimes, listen, I love asking questions, but at a certain time we have to realize which questions we want to keep asking and which questions we just have to say, there's no answer, let's move on. And so while I'm kind of interested in finding out about the deity, the Lord, midst of heaven God, there's just not a lot in this text, at least, that's going to feed my interest. And I've got to move on to Izanagi and Izanami. What's interesting then about Izanami and Izanagi, number one, they're not the first gods. They're not the creators of existence, so to speak, right? As a matter of fact, that's another interesting thing. I'm segueing now into the setting, discussing the setting here. But what we see here is the first words of the text one more time. When heaven and earth first appeared, there came into existence in the plane of high heaven. So we know this setting is the plane of high heaven. There came into existence in the plane of high heaven a deity named Lord, midst of heaven God, and high creative force God, and divine creative force God. What's interesting about that is that gods did not create existence. As a matter of fact, where did this universe come from? It just says, when heaven and earth first appeared. What's fascinating to me about that is coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, where there was always God. God was always there, and then one day he decided to create existence of everything else. That's not the case here, right? There's not an eternal God. There's not even an eternal plane of high heaven. The text says, when it first appeared. It appeared one day. Where from? I'm not sure. But that might confuse me, because coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, that might confuse me and say, well, somebody had to create it, except if you take a philosophy of religion class, which I teach every now and again. What question can we ask to the Christians? Well, Christians will say, well, God created all of existence. Well, what question are they avoiding and not asking? Where did God come from? And then, of course, in the Christian tradition, people will typically, oh, God was always there, right? But for some people, that's not entirely a satisfying question. What do you mean it was always there? God was always there. So I want us to recognize our own standpoints at a certain point, right? I'm standing from this tradition, a Christian tradition, which, ingrained in me that God was always there, an eternal God. And the God created everything else. Well, that's just as illogical that there's an eternal God, because why isn't it reasonable to ask, where did God come from? And of course, the Christian tradition will suggest, well, God was always there. God didn't come from anything. That might not satisfy many people. And if we're looking at it from an outsider's perspective, I don't know why that would satisfy some people. Now, there's a long tradition of philosophy of religion that tries to address these kinds of problems. But what I don't want to discuss that tradition right now, that philosophy of religion. What I do want to point out, though, is that seems as unstable a starting place as this other tradition that we find in the Kojiki that suggests, oh, one day it appeared. One day the plane of high heaven appeared. From where? Don't ask that question. Right? And that helps me understand my own position a little bit better and say, well, wait a second, isn't it just as ridiculous a claim to suggest that God was always there as to say, well, one day it just appeared, right? There's an old philosophical claim, right? An old philosophical problem where a philosopher, a old grandmother walks up to the philosopher and says, philosopher, Mr. Philosopher, don't you know that there's a turtle that supports the entire universe? And the philosopher says, yes, but what is that turtle standing on? What's supporting the turtle? And the old grandmother says, well, why another turtle, of course, right? And then the philosopher says, and what's supporting that turtle? And the grandmother wisely suggests, it's turtles all the way down. You need a starting point. We need a starting point, right? No starting point is any more reasonable than any other starting point sometimes. Well, we could talk a philosophy of religion question here to really see what starting points are reasonable and which are less reasonable. But there's always going to be that philosophical problem when we read a religious creation text like the Kojiki, or like the Old Testament, or like any other number of creation texts from around the world. There's always going to be a starting point that we just have to grant the culture, right? And so I want to hold back from asking, isn't this illogical? Well, it's not any more illogical to suggest that the plane of high heaven just appeared. It's not any more illogical than any other creation myth starting point, right? So that's what reading literature from Japan like this is actually teaching me, is how to wrestle with that, yeah? So that was a little bit of a diversion. Let's get back to the characters then, regarding we talked a little bit about the setting. Let's go back to the characters of Izanagi and Izanami. One thing that's fascinating to me about them is it's very clear. Izanagi is the male, and Izanami is the female. Well, what else do religious myths give us? Religious myths and creation myths not only give us the details of creation, but they also give us a whole set of morality along with it. And here we see this morality of sex roles within the Kojiki. As we read a little bit further, we'll see the male Izanagi has very specific roles, and the female Izanami has a very specific role, right? Let's skip forward just a little bit, which really illustrates some details of their sex and gender roles in ancient Japan. So a little bit further down, I've got a streak of immaturity within me. So I love this kind of naughty stuff that we're talking about. But for me to summarize a little bit of the plot right here, Izanagi looks down at his crotch, presumably, and says, hey, look here, there's something that comes out. And then he points to Izanami, says, hey, look at you. You've got something that kind of goes in. Maybe these two things should go together. Now, forgive me, but they're talking about sex. He's talking about his male sex organ and Izanami's female sex organ, which I just find it humorous, because I am a little boy at heart. But then they have sex. They ultimately have sex. We've got a sex scene right at the beginning of the Kojiki. I love it. I love this kind of dirty stuff. However, how does the sex scene go? Having thus agreed, Izanagi then said, you walk around from the right, and I will walk around from the left and meet you. Having agreed to this, they circled around. Then Izanami, the female, said first, oh, how a good lad. After which Izanagi said, oh, how a good maiden. After each had finished speaking, Izanagi said to his spouse, it is not proper that the woman speak first. Why is that interesting to me, that little textual detail? Well, we're already getting some morality from the Kojiki, specifically morality about sex roles. Here we are starting with just a simple line. It is not proper during sex that women speak first. Now, can we see that there is this male patriarchy that the Kojiki text is going to prescribe, therefore? And throughout Japanese history, even to today, by the way, Japanese history, let's talk about world history, actually, right? Throughout world history, we're still dealing with these issues of gender and sex roles, and especially this patriarchal hierarchy, where male is somehow above the female, right? In social settings and things like that. What's fascinating to me about this is it's right here, dictated in this text, so that there is no debate. And that is going to be another important role, of course, for these creation myths and these religious texts, to not only teach the mythological history, but also how to act today. So there is morality in this text. We don't want to get quite too much into it. But then, along with this sex roles, right? So why are these sex roles really dictated in this text? How do we know this? Because it says right there, a little bit below, the woman spoke first, the outcome was not good. And what happens as a result of this inappropriate sex? So they're already dictating how to have sex. Women don't talk first during sex. However, what happens is she gives birth to a swift burning fire deity, and as a result gets sick and dies. Why did she get sick and die? Because she spoke during sex. Now, isn't that a good lesson for us, right? Women, don't speak during sex first, otherwise you'll give birth to a fire and burn yourself up and die, right? Now, we could talk a lot about the history around that and stuff like this, especially about not only infant mortality rate, but also mother mortality rates during childbirth, right? Which, in prehistoric times, actually before modern times, before modern medicine, women dying during childbirth is quite common. And here we've got an excuse for that, because women don't act appropriately. That's interesting to me. That's quite interesting to me, right? However, Izanagi now, the male, survives, and he goes on living. What happens as a result? Well, Izanami dies and goes to the underworld, and Izanagi goes and visits her, and he leaves the underworld alone again. But let's go a little bit further now. Izanagi gives birth to 3 children: Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Tsukuyomi. Amaterasu, the god of sun, Susanoo, the god of the sea, and Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon. Why is that interesting? Well, number one, we never really meet Tsukuyomi for the rest of the text. But we do get a nice big interaction and exchange between Amaterasu and Susanoo. Here's another interesting thing, just to catch a little bit of logic here. How are they born? He washed, Izanagi, he washed his left eye, and Amaterasu is born. He washes his right eye, and there came into existence Tsukuyomi, the moon god. And then he washed his nose, and there came into existence Susanoo. I'm immature, so I like this exchange between Amaterasu and Susanoo. Why? Because we've got Susanoo as a sort of trickster, what some folks have called trickster deity. Not exactly a villain, but not exactly the ideal god. And as Amaterasu and Susanoo are having some beef at Amaterasu's palace, he poops in his hand and throws it around everywhere. And of course, many of her godly deity servants die out of shame and stuff like this. So Susanoo, I'm just trying to picture this, him throwing poop all over the place. You'll forgive me. I think that's hilarious. What we do find then, however, is as a result of this, Susanoo is painted as a villain. It seems to me that Susanoo is a villainous sort of character. I called him a trickster a minute ago, but we see how he redeems himself a little bit later in the text. Why? How does that work? Why should a villainous character be redeemed later on? So how can we make sense of Susanoo redeeming himself and becoming a hero? Well, what happens? He gets banished and must go to the land of Izumo. And what happens in Izumo? He finds a dragon, kills this dragon, turns the dragon's tail into a sword, actually one of the 3 imperial regalia in Japanese culture, and marries a woman. How is it that Susanoo actually becomes a hero through that tale? Well, let's skip over, because I have discussed a bit of the characters, a bit of the setting, and a bit of the plot of these stories, of some of the stories at least. Let's skip over now to the connections side and talk a little bit about the history, or rather, history connected with the text and the structural function of the text. Well, one thing that I hope is obvious to us by this point is that this text is a mythological text. What is a myth? Right? Here's one point that I want to jettison and put to the side when I use the word myth. I don't want to talk about either the factual basis or the fictional basis of the story. That's not at all what I want to talk about when I talk about myths. Why? Well, because it's hard to figure out. Take a philosophy class, after all, and you'll learn that it's hard to figure out what the nature of truth versus falsehood is anyway, right? I think in the year 2020, we could really see how this is coming to a crux, how people have disagreements about truth and falsehood anyway. In many cases, some folks will suggest that it's a political question. What is truth and what is falsehood? I don't want to get into that question. Rather, I want to try to talk about myths in other ways. What is a myth? What is its function in society? What is its function for the readers? Well, one thing is that we see here is that it's giving us a unified culture and unifying us, isn't it? If we are in Japan in the year 712, or in this region that today we call Japan in the year 712, what is this myth doing? How does it function? It functions to unite us as a culture, doesn't it? What are some other myths? And I don't want to talk about the factual nature or the fictional nature of a myth. But another myth that I could think of, that creation myths, I already discussed. The Christian, Judeo-Christian and Islamic myths, creation myths, and their religious myths. And how do they function? They function as a unifying feature of our community, don't they? Not only do they unify our community, but what else do they do? They also give us, as we've seen earlier, a set of morals to live by, right? So then, how do we make sense? How might we make sense of why this Kojiki text is even here? Well, let's talk a little bit about the history around this text, right? A little bit about the history is that it was commissioned by the Emperor Temu around the 7th century. And of course, it was finished after Temu died. Why would an emperor want to compile a set of Japanese myths? Well, when we look at the history of Japan at the time of the 7th century, there was a lot of strife within the archipelago. Strife over what? Power. Power. And what do these myths do? Well, we started off these myths by reading off a genealogy of so many of the gods. And what do these myths function to do then? Well, we didn't get into the text here, but you see, when you read in detail, that there will be a genealogy, and you could trace from the very first Lord midst of heaven God, and then the high creative God, and then the divine creative force God, to Izanami and Izanagi, to Amaterasu, and then ultimately to the emperors of Japan, Temu. So now are we kind of answering some questions about why Temu would want to commission the collection of this Kojiki? It seems like he wants to tell people that he is a descendant of the gods. Why ever would he want that? Why ever would he want to tell such a story? Power is one. So he wants to try to consolidate power in this, today, what we call the Japanese archipelago. He wants to consolidate the power of the Yamato tribe. There are many other competing tribes all over what we call Japan today. And he wants to consolidate power to himself as the Yamato emperor, and thus the emperor of all Japan. Wow. After all, he is descended from the gods. Doesn't that give him authority to rule? Where would you get the idea, by the way, that being descendant of the gods gives you authority to rule? Well, as the answer to many of those sorts of questions, the origin of such ideas in ancient Japan is just over the other side of the pond in a little place called China. Because after all, China has an emperor. And guess what the Chinese emperor says about himself? That he is descendant of the gods. So Temu looks around and goes, wait a second, that sounds good. I want to be descendant of the gods now. Find me the Kojiki myths. Collect up those myths for us and make me descendant of the gods. Now do we see how this is starting to make sense a bit, right? Well, let's go back to my earlier question. Why does Susanoo become a redeemer? Where does he get his redeeming role in these texts? One theory is, where does he go? He goes to the land of Izumo, which is far from the Yamato political center. One series of ideas from scholars that scholars have tried to deduce is that Susanoo was one of the gods from the Izumo peoples. And if you want to conquer such Izumo peoples, what do you have to do? Well, there's two options. You could either try to obliterate the whole peoples, which is darn near impossible, or you can try to incorporate them and thus consolidate power onto yourself by suggesting, by the way, your gods are good gods too. Susanoo, he's a great god. Look, he's one of our gods. He's just went over there, whereas I'm the descendant of Amaterasu. So it does play this unifying role, doesn't it? And that's what a lot of these creation myths, not just in Japan, but all over the world do, right? Is to try to trace back to God. We see this in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well, in the Judeo-Christian Bible, in the book of Matthew. And then somewhere in there we get to Abraham. And then somewhere in there we get to King David and King Solomon. And then where do we get? To Jesus. To show this genealogical connection to the gods. So we see that importance of genealogy in ancient Japan, in ancient China, in ancient Middle East, and thus spreading from as Christianity did. But wait a second, isn't genealogy even important to us in 2020? Just watching TV the other day, and there's a commercial for, hey, get your DNA tested so you can know where you came from. You can know your genealogy. And then we get these people on the commercial saying, wow, I didn't know that I was from that part of the world. Now, you'll forgive me because that is absolutely irrelevant to me. I don't really care about my genealogy. You'll forgive me. If you care, God bless you, right? But we see that people even today care about genealogy with these DNA tests. So this isn't such a far out idea now, is it? And that is going to be the role, one of the roles at least, that these myths play. And I find that a very important aspect of the Kojiki text, right? I find that to be a very important aspect of the Kojiki text, the political connections that are necessary there. Let's go back then for a second, because I did skip over one of the story elements, themes. So then what themes do we see in these myths? Well, I've listed some. We're talking about social and gender roles, morality ultimately. We're talking about the story of creation and so many deities. We talk about religion, not just Shinto religion, but we smell little pieces of Buddhism as well in here. How can we smell Buddhism? Well, hold on for a quick second. We clearly, I just described, the Chinese influence on the Kojiki myths. And of course, the political legitimization of the Yamato emperor. I might call him a chieftain, but he wants to call himself an emperor now. So these are some of the themes that we see in these Kojiki myths. And those themes do play a role and help me understand the text a whole lot better. Now, talking about Buddhism really quick. I described the Kojiki at the opening of this talk as the primary text of Shinto. Where does Buddhism come in? Well, in fact, Buddhism is ingrained in Shinto from at least 700, actually even before, right? Buddhism is already in Japan, and Buddhism is already in this text via the Chinese influence. Now, can we understand Shinto before even Buddhism? Not in this text, we can't. We're going to see in Japanese literature this togetherness of Buddhism, Shintoism, and all sorts of other ideas. Confucianism, later on, in other texts, I mean. And it's going to be too difficult, for this talk at least, to disentangle all those things. They're all wrapped up together. And to try to separate in the Kojiki the Shinto from the Buddhism is darn near impossible. Now, what do some scholars do? Well, they might, some scholars, like archaeologists, are going to try to look in the distant past, the prehistoric, the pre-literate past of Japan, at the archaeological records before Buddhism in China and Japan. And that's how we might be able to squeeze out or tease out details of Shintoism without Buddhism. But to separate the two in a neat way is, in my estimation, darn near impossible. I remember growing up, there's Christianity, there's Judaism, and there's Islam. Different religions. You can't be a Christian Jew, right? Or a Jewish Christian, or an Islamic Christian. That just doesn't make sense. These are three distinct religions, three distinct traditions, and they are mutually exclusive, ultimately. However, that's not the case in Japanese history. We've got this entanglement of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and Shintoism all together and intertwined and entangled. And it's going to be too difficult, I believe, to really disentangle these things and say this is the true nature of Shinto without all those other influences. Yeah. That to me is quite fascinating and quite interesting. Yeah. I know I'm taking up a lot of time here, so let me go into I'm going to skip over some details. Let me go into some intertextual connections that I find very fascinating here. Earlier I discussed the visit of Izanagi to the underworld, right, to get his wife Izanami. What's fascinating to me about that is that almost exactly reminds me of the ancient Greek myth of Orpheus visiting the underworld. Now, this isn't a ancient Greek literature lecture. However, the details are there where the man goes to the underworld to rescue his wife. Now, if you look at a map, Greece is really far from Japan. How can we make sense of this similarity? Well, one theory that I like is that, and it's not so much a theory, it's almost uncontroversial. Globalization has been happening since ancient times and prehistoric times, right? Some of us might remember from our ancient history classes something called the Silk Road. And what is the Silk Road? It ultimately connects Europe all the way to China. You don't think that people shared stories along this path? Now, these ancient Greek texts are from, let's call it around the year 500 BC, 500 years before the Common Era. And this Kojiki myth collection was compiled in the year 700. That's a difference of 1,200 years. Do you think that in 1,200 years, a story can get from ancient Greece all the way to Japan? Now, is it going to be the exact same myth? No, of course. We remember the childhood game of telephone, don't we? Where the myth is going to change. The story is going to change along the route. Right? But I want to show this sort of intertextual connection to say, look how global, how small the world is, even 1,000 years ago. To me, I find that amazing. I find that just amazing. That today we think, oh no, it's only today that the world is so small that I could fly in a plane around the world, right? I could get anywhere else in the world within probably a day or two today. Well, yeah, that technology is there today. The internet, I could talk to somebody on the other side of the world instantly. However, people have been talking with each other all over the world for millennia. I find that fascinating. Now, what other sort of story do we see in these Kojiki myths? We see a story that is completely separate from all the other stories. This story about a magic fishhook. But there's this magic fishhook story in the Kojiki. Where else do I remember a magic fishhook story? Well, it so happens that there was recently a cartoon starring The Rock called Moana. Does anybody remember that movie? And that's a Polynesian story or a South Pacific story, South Pacific myth about what? A magic fishhook. So we see how all of these different stories, all of these different traditions, this globalization is really contributing to what we have today in the Kojiki. That this globalization, not just in my theory from Greece, but also from the South Pacific, which is a lot closer to Japan, by the way, but more difficult because of the sea. And so we get all of these stories from all over the world, ultimately, in the Kojiki myths. A very early example of globalization. Let me wrap this up with my own connections to self. Well, I've already said that I like the humorous parts. I like the parts about sex. I'm sorry, I'm very immature. I like the parts where Susanoo is throwing around poop all over the palace. Again, I'm a little bit immature. Forgive me, right? But I also liked another story that we didn't talk about today, the Yamato Takeru story, and how brutal it was, and how he chops up his brother, right? Who doesn't come to dinner on time. I love that. So I really liked a lot of these features in the Kojiki. Why do you think they wrote a story that people like me would like? Well, probably to help spread the myth. Doesn't that help spread myths? I think so. I think so. And I think that when we understand a lot of that aspect, we could try to better understand the role that this Kojiki is playing. Not just read it as a text, but try to keep asking questions about the history, about what role it's playing, about how it's structured, about how it works, about its connections to other literatures or other texts that you might know of, and how that helps me better understand the Kojiki that we're wrestling with today. Yeah? One last thing that I do want to throw in regarding the text is this. In this text, we see poetry. And traditionally, the first Japanese poem is found in the Kojiki. And who is the assumed author of the first Japanese poem? Susanoo. That's where we see a little bit of that Buddhist influence, by the way, right? Let me read from that poem. In 8 cloud rising is Zumo, an 8-fold fence to enclose my wife. An 8-fold fence I build, and oh, that 8-fold fence. Now, I don't think this is a brilliant piece of poetry. As a matter of fact, I think it's pretty bad in terms of poetry. It just repeats the same thing over and over again. But let me think now. With that piece of poetry there, why does it repeat 8-fold, 8-fold, 8-fold? Well, those of us who know a little bit about Chinese history and Chinese Buddhism, 8 is a magical number. The 8-fold path of Buddhism relieves our existence of suffering. 8 is a magical number coming from China to Japan now, and now we've got Susanoo saying 8-fold fence, 8-fold fence. And that's where I said there's smells like a little bit of Buddhism here. Right? Smells like a little bit of Buddhism. Furthermore, what we've got here is the dominant form of poetry. If you count the syllables in that poem, we've got 5 lines that go 5, 7, 5, 7, 7. 31 total syllables. That's going to be the dominant form of Japanese poetry for the next more than 1,000 years, called tanka. That's the tanka form. And that is amazing that we've got it so early in this text. So early, from the beginning of Japanese literature, this dominant form of which the tradition continues even to this day, over 1,000 years. So I like that little aspect too, that we've got poetry mixed in with the prose. And that is going to be a tradition that we'll see later on in Japanese history, in Japanese literature as well. Yeah. I hope that some of this helps us understand. There's a ton about the Kojiki that we didn't discuss today. But I hope that this starts to get our wheels turning about how we might want to read this, how we might want to understand the Kojiki, and helps us try to make sense of some of these things that, for me, are kind of weird at first. But if you give the effort, what was originally weird or illogical starts to make quite a bit of sense. And that's what I love about reading Japanese history. See you next time.